according to St. Luke, chapter 13. On a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue leader said to the people, "There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." The Lord answered him, "You hypocrites! Doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan had kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" When he said this, all his opponents were humiliated, but the people were delighted with all the wonderful things he was doing. The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. Well, grace and peace to the disciples of Christ. I'm happy to be back here at my home church today. But I have to admit, I do learn a lot when I lead worship in different churches. Some people are generous in sharing their thoughts and opinions about preaching. Recently, I heard the definition of a good sermon. The definition of a good sermon is, it should have a good beginning, should have a good ending, and they should come as close together as possible. Well, I hope that wasn't aimed at me. But if it was, we'll have to see if any of this part of this definition has gotten through to me. As I read and reflected on our gospel lesson from Luke 13 today, it occurred to me that one could make a pretty good case that this reading, this gospel reading from Luke, is like a microcosm of our typical journey through life. It contains elements of love and hate, bondage and freedom, sorrow and joy, obedience and disobedience, and our struggles with man's laws versus Christ's law. So I'm going to try to help us make sense of all this by going a little bit beyond the obvious today. But having said that, let's begin with the notion that might well be an obvious conclusion after reading the gospel lesson. There's an old adage that says, rules are made to be broken. That's not a concept we often think of in the context of being followers of Christ or disciples of Christ. And yet, Jesus made it sound okay, even righteous. When rules stand in the way of ministering to the needs of those around us, in this case, Jesus broke the rules as he set people free. So let's focus on one of those common themes in man's journey through life, which I observed is also a theme in today's gospel lesson, and that is bondage and freedom. When the Bible has many references to the concepts of bondage and freedom, they're everywhere. In the Old Testament, we remember that during the Exodus, the central event of Jewish history, by the way, Moses led the people out of slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land. Bondage versus freedom. Isaiah, also in the Old Testament, writes about his prophecy about the Messiah coming that will set the captives free, free from their sin. Bondage versus freedom. In the New Testament, A common image that we have of Christ on the cross is Jesus setting us free from this bondage of our own sins. Bondage versus freedom. And also in the New Testament, there are countless times that Paul writes letters, one particular to the Galatians, where he encourages them to stand fast in their freedom and not allow themselves to be placed in bondage again. Bondage versus freedom. In the gospel lesson today, Jesus breaks the rules. In doing so, he sets people free. He sets the woman free. He sets the leader of the synagogue free. And he sets the crowd surrounding them free. So first, let's talk about the woman. The woman is described as being crippled by a spirit, an evil demon. We don't know exactly what her physical ailment was, but it probably was similar to a hunchback or osteoporosis. But Luke does not call it a sickness. He's very careful to emphasize and call it a spirit that has bound the woman for some 18 years. Even though it was the Sabbath, a day when the work of healing is not supposed to take place, Jesus frees the woman from bondage of that spirit and enables her to stand upright. Jesus not only frees her spiritually and physically, but he also set her free socially. To put it in its proper context, when Jesus first sees the woman, he addresses her as woman. But by the time she is healed, he addresses her as a daughter of Abraham. Now, in this context, this is one of the rare times that this title is used. This elevates the woman onto the status level with a man. And her relationship with God is no longer based on her relationship with a man. Now, as Christians, we're called to carry on the ministry of Jesus Christ. And we do this in a number of ways. We can set people free from insufficient or lack of housing by our participation in something like Lutherans for Humanity, which is the branch of Habitat for Humanity, or Aurora, or similar ministries where the basic needs of people are met. That's one way we can help to set people free. We set people free by donating water and diapers to the homeless, or by participating in a garage sale to help a family in need. Sometimes we set people free with a smile, a word of encouragement. We can ease their burdens and lighten their loads through a listening ear or a heartfelt hug. But the woman was not the only one that was freed from bondage. Now let's talk about the synagogue leader. The synagogue leader was in bondage to rules. The man-made laws that were never meant to trump God's law of love and compassion. He was so busy being a pious, good person and keeping all the rules that he had ceased to be a compassionate and loving person. We know today that through the gift of grace, in God's greater scheme of things, people always come before the rules. So Jesus confronts the man with his hypocrisy. There are certain acts of mercy towards animals, such as freeing the beast of a burden, that even he would do. Jesus points out that people are more important than animals. And people deserve a greater amount of mercy. In our gospel lesson, Luke records that the man and those who agreed with him were humiliated and ashamed. And it's hoped that their shame caused them to ponder their priorities after that. And their lives were set free from those rules. And now, Jesus' actions towards the leader of the synagogue should also challenge us to ponder our bondage to rules. Think about this just a minute. How often does the fact that people break a rule or limit our ability to love them and treat them with care and respect? When do rules such as never be late keep us from spending time with family members or coworkers? When does our fear of strangers prevent us from helping people in need? The message here is that rules do give order to our lives and to our society. And they are valuable gifts from God that He has given us. But they are never to prevent or hinder love. Finally, let's talk about the crowd. The bystanders in our gospel lesson were also set free. Luke records that the people were delighted at all the wonderful things that Jesus was doing. God's priority of love was affirmed to the crowd. They now realized that God was not a divine traffic cop waiting to write them up or give them a ticket or arrest them. Rather, they now understood that God was a loving God who wanted to set them free. As disciples of Christ, we know that experiencing the love of God is a powerful thing. Through that love, we too are set free. We are empowered with a life to live abundantly. So in closing, I simply want to remind us that bondage and freedom are indeed common themes that we all encounter in our life's journey. As we read about Jesus' actions towards the woman and the synagogue leader, and how they were set free, we too are challenged to recognize and identify those times when we need to admit our own bondage. And we're reminded to turn to God in order to be set free. Don't turn to the law. Don't turn to a set of rules made by man. We are surrounded, when we live in grace, we are surrounded by God's love. Love always trumps the law. Let me say that again. Love always trumps the law. That's God's law. We have a lot to be grateful for. We have a lot to be grateful for in our personal lives, in our community lives here at St. Mark's, in our community lives here in Evansville and the area. Through grace, we have a lot to be grateful for. Because through grace, we celebrate that the cross of Christ, His death and His resurrection, we have all been set free. To me, that sounds a lot like a lot to be grateful for. Amen.